We don't take off spec grain from ghost farms, Ruth. Dale Frick said it without looking up. He slid the lap sheet back across the co-op counter with 2 fingers, the same 2 fingers he'd used to wave off a stray dog, and the printout skimmed the edge of Ruth Callahan's canvas bag and settled there with a dry, papery snap. Thin as a whisper and twice as deliberate. The laughter broke loose like a gate slapped open by wind. Not big laughter. The small, embarrassed kind that hides in the back of a room. A man near the scale let it out first, a single huff through his nose. Another followed. Nobody said stop. The whole building went still underneath that sound. 30 farmers in work jackets and muddy boots, standing in the smell of diesel and split grain, and not one of them moved. A hand froze on a clipboard. 2 sets of eyes went to the floor. Neil Ostrander, standing 2 paces back from the counter, set his jaw and looked at the far wall and said nothing. Ruth was 69 years old, 5'4" in her husband's old canvas coat. She had driven 40 minutes in the dark to be here by 6:45 a.m. Her hair was gray and pulled back. Her hands were the hands of a woman who had run 480 acres alone for 4 years. She put her palm flat on the printout and did not pull it back. She looked at Dale. She did not blink. Dale turned half away. He addressed the room as if Ruth had already left it. 69 years old and still chasing Owen's ghost. Those tin cans aren't silos, they're lawn ornaments. A third farmer looked at his boots. Neil Ostrander's hands went still at his sides. But what Dale Frick didn't know, what none of the men at that counter knew, was that inside Ruth's kitchen drawer, back at the farm, sat a signed 3-year contract worth $214,000. And the man who signed it had driven 4 hours round trip to taste her flour. Do you know that feeling when someone has already decided you're finished and you're the only one in the room who knows they're wrong? She didn't argue. She didn't have to. Because 18 miles away, a phone was already ringing. But before we get to that call, let's go back 4 years, to the morning Owen Callahan died, and the promise Ruth made standing alone in that wheat field. That morning came without warning, the way the worst ones do. It was early October 2018. Owen had been feeling a tightness in his chest for 3 days. He told Ruth it was nothing. He always said that, not to deceive her, but because he was the kind of man who believed the body could be argued out of most things if you refused to give them attention. At 5:40 a.m., he was on the floor of the kitchen, and Ruth was on the phone, and her voice was very steady, because being steady was the only useful thing available to her. By 7:10 a.m., the paramedics were loading the stretcher into the ambulance in the gray October dark, and Ruth was standing in the stubble of the west field because the kitchen was too small and the yard was too loud and the field was the only place she had ever fully understood how to be still. She had his thermos. Steel, dented on one side where he dropped it on the equipment shed floor in 1997 and never replaced, because Owen did not believe in replacing things that still worked. She didn't realize she was holding it until she looked down. The stubble was 12 inches high, gold gray in the October light that was only just beginning. Owen had told her 2 days before that the protein was the best it had ever been. He'd said it the way he said everything that mattered to him, plainly, without decoration. The way a person states a fact about the weather when they are sure of the weather. He had crumbled a handful of soil in his palm and held it up and studied it in the morning light and said, "The protein's good. Ruth, best year we've had." She stood in the field until the ambulance was gone. Then she made herself a promise, not out loud, not to anyone who could hear it. She promised Owen she would not let the farm go. She would not sell it. She would not stop improving the grain. She would finish what they had started together, and she would do it better than they had done it, and she would do it alone. You have to understand what that promise cost. Not the emotional weight, though that was real, and it rode her shoulders every day for months. The practical cost. Owen had managed the soil program for 31 years. He had handled the seeding schedules, the moisture monitoring, the lab relationships, the market timing. He had woken at 4 a.m. to check the humidity readings in the silos and come back to bed without waking her, because he thought she didn't know he was doing it. She knew. She had always known. She had let him do it because he was better at it. And because watching someone you love do something they're genuinely good at is one of the quiet, unremarked pleasures of a long marriage. You don't catalog it while it's happening. You understand it later. Now she would do all of it. Every test, every early morning, every calculation and correction and lab fee. She started that same week with Owen's records. He kept everything in green composition books, one per field section, one per growing season, going back to 1991. She pulled them from the cabinet in the equipment shed and sat on the workbench in the cold October afternoon and read them from the beginning. 31 years of his handwriting. Numbers and notes and diagrams and amendments and failures and corrections. She read it like a letter from someone who had been trying to teach her something his whole life without ever sitting her down and saying, "Here, let me teach you this." She ordered the extension soil testing manual. She called Gerald Pratt, the agronomist who'd worked with Owen for 12 years, and introduced herself, Owen's wife, Ruth, and asked him to start over from the beginning and explain everything as if she were completely new. Because she was. Gerald was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then he said, "Yes, of course." He drove out to the farm twice that first fall and walked the fields with her and pointed at the soil and explained what she was seeing. The color changes that indicated drainage issues, the compaction indicators, the way the stubble sat in each section, and what that told you about the root structure underneath. Ruth walked beside him with a yellow pad and took notes in her own version of Owen's shorthand. She still has those notes. The first independent lab test came back in the spring of 2019. She drove the sample to the county extension office alone, 40 minutes each way on the county road, still learning the distances without Owen in the passenger seat. She paid $35 out of pocket because she didn't want it billed to the farm account yet, didn't want anyone asking about it. She sat in the parking lot of the extension office and read the result in the car. Protein 13.4%. Not good enough. The industry premium threshold was 14.0%. She was 6/10 below it. She folded the result sheet in half, tucked it in her coat pocket, and drove home. She made a list that evening at the kitchen table. Sulfur amendment in the west field. Different seed source for the northeast section. The seed company in Havre that Owen had been considering before he got sick. Tighter moisture management through the heading phase. She wrote each item in plain language with a target date beside it. Then she cooked dinner and ate it, and washed the dishes and went to bed. No one knew she was doing any of this. Not Neil. Not her daughter Claire in Billings, who called every Sunday and asked about the farm in the way of a person who loves someone without fully understanding what they do. Not anyone at the co-op or the elevator or the extension office. She was just a widow paying for grain tests, one name on a list. This was not modesty. It was discipline. She had decided the work would speak for itself when it was ready, and not before. The second season, 13.8%. Closer, she made a different list. The third season, 14.3%. Above threshold, her hands were steady when she unfolded the result sheet in the extension parking lot. But her chest was doing something she did not try to name. 14.3. She checked the farm identifier twice. She read the protein number 3 times and then set the paper on the passenger seat and looked through the windshield at the concrete front wall of the extension office building and sat with it for a while. Then she drove home and checked the East Silo's moisture reading. Optimal. 3 consecutive readings at optimal. She didn't tell a soul. You know this feeling? Maybe. The feeling of knowing something is true before the rest of the world has confirmed it. The feeling of working in silence, because the silence is protecting the work from people who would form an opinion before it was finished. Ruth had been in that silence for 3 years, and she had gotten used to it, and she intended to stay in it until she had something that could not be argued with. 2 days before Owen died, they had been in the West Field together at dawn. This was their fall ritual, the early walk through the stubble. Just the two of them, the thermos between them on the ground, the sky going from grey to rose-orange in the east. Owen always knelt at the edge of a row and crumbled a handful of soil in his palm. He had done this since his father taught him. He could read things in soil that a lab report took 2 weeks to approximate. That morning, he crumbled and held the soil up in the early light and said, "The protein's going to come in high this year. Best we've had. I can feel it in the structure. The soil's where I wanted it." Ruth knelt beside him and took her own handful. She had learned to read soil through 30 years of watching. She thought he was right. She said so. "You're getting my eye," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't fully understood until she was alone in the field 2 days later with the ambulance driving away. Not nostalgia. Something like completion. A man who had been teaching someone for 30 years without calling it teaching, and who could see it had worked. She thought about it every time she knelt in the field. The silos were part of the story, and you need to understand what they actually were. Owen had built them in 1991. It was a 2-summer project. He designed the placement himself, accounting for the prevailing north wind and the drainage gradient, and he sourced the corrugated steel from a supplier in Great Falls and installed it with 3 hired hands over 2 long weekends that August. The total cost had made the bank manager raise his eyebrows. Owen had not changed his mind. The silos were properly sealed and properly ventilated, and Owen knew exactly what he had built. He installed the humidity monitoring system in 2004 in the West Silo and extended it to the East Silo in 2006, wiring them himself with a system he had researched through a university extension bulletin and adapted to the specific dimensions of his setup. After he died, the silos faded. A barn swallow nested under the east eave the second spring. Ruth left it alone. She maintained the monitoring system on Owen's schedule, checked it on his timetable, and logged every reading in the same green composition books with the same format: date, temperature, moisture percentage, any deviation, the cause of the deviation, and the corrective action if one was needed. 3 seasons of records, every entry in her handwriting, in the same composition books. Nobody had ever asked to see them. Nobody knew they were there except Ruth. What happened next, nobody saw coming. In early spring of 2021, 2.5 years after Owen died, the third season of Silent Testing, Neil Ostrander came over the fence line one Tuesday morning while Ruth was loading sample bags into the truck. Neil was 58 years old and had farmed the property to the east for 25 years without making much noise about anything. He leaned on the fence post and they talked about spring planting and the extended forecast, and then Neil said, in the way he always said anything important, as if it were almost beside the point, "Fellow from Missoula called me last winter. Some kind of mill buyer. Artisan flour operation, I think he said. He was asking around about local wheat sources, high protein, consistent moisture management. I gave him a couple names. Didn't really follow up on it." Ruth stopped loading. What was his name, Neil thought. Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb. Did he leave a number? Neil shrugged. I might have it somewhere. He went back to his work. Ruth drove to the extension office to drop the samples, then came home and sat at the kitchen table and wrote on a piece of paper, Marcus Webb. Missoula Mill. She filed it. The 2021 result wasn't back yet. When it came in at 14.6%, she sat in the parking lot for a long time. She was getting close to something she had been building toward for 3 years without announcing what she was building. A few weeks after that reading, Ruth stopped at the co-op for supplies and heard Dale Fricker's voice at the counter while she was at the back of the store. He was talking to Pete Schultz, a younger farmer who treated Dale's opinions like weather reports, accurate by default. The thing about the Callahan place, Dale said, is that Owen always ran it on stubbornness rather than science. Good man, I mean that. But the farm's been coasting on his reputation since he died. Ruth's going to have to face what it's actually worth before long. Nobody's going to tell her the truth, so it'll just go on until it can't. Pete made some sound of agreement. Ruth stood in the back of the store with a bag of feed supplement in each hand and listened to all of it. She let Dale finish. She waited until he'd moved on to a different conversation. She carried her bags to the counter, paid, and drove home. She checked the East Silo's moisture reading that evening. Optimal. She entered it in the log. Then she looked up the Missoula Chamber of Commerce number and wrote it on the back of the co-op receipt. She made the call the next morning at 8:45. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring. He already knew Neil Ostrander's name. He had, in fact, been searching for Ruth for 6 weeks. A contact had forwarded him a single unlabeled lab result from a Judith Basin County farm. No name, no farm identifier, just the numbers, and the numbers had been good enough that he'd spent a month and a half trying to trace it back to a source. Now he had her on the phone. They talked for 40 minutes. He asked about the silos. She described them, the dimensions, the seal, the ventilation design, the orientation to the prevailing north wind, the interior temperature differential between summer and winter. He asked about the humidity logs. She described those too, every reading since 2004 in the green composition books. Owen's format preserved exactly. He asked if he could come to the farm. When? Ruth said. Next week, Marcus said. If that works. It works, she said. Marcus Webb arrived on a Thursday in late November, in a truck with the mill's name painted on the driver's door. He brought a clipboard and a refractometer and a small pack of field testing equipment, and he was the kind of person who doesn't make small talk before he's seen what he came to see. He started with the silos. He walked around both of them. He pressed his palm to the corrugated steel, feeling the seal, the temperature differential, the quality of the ventilation. He asked about the patch on the east side, a section Owen had replaced in 2003 after a hailstorm bent the original panel. Ruth described the repair, The gauge of the new steel, the sealant compound, the weather-stripping Owen had laid at the seam. He asked to see inside. Ruth opened the east silo. The smell was clean and dry, grain dust and nothing else. No fermentation note, no dampness, just the pure mineral smell of well-kept hard red winter wheat in proper storage. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment. He was breathing deliberately, the way you breathe when smell is data. Then he pulled a sample and ran a quick field test with the refractometer. He looked at the result. He looked at Ruth. "I want to see the logs," he said. She brought the binder inside and made coffee. Real coffee. Not the instant she'd been making since the funeral, and laid out 3 seasons of humidity logs on the kitchen table, oldest on the left. Every date, every reading, every deviation noted and explained and corrected. Every entry in her handwriting, in Owen's green composition books. Marcus went through the binder 1 page at a time. He did not rush. The coffee went cold at his elbow while he read. At one point he said, without looking up, "How long have you been on this monitoring schedule?" "Since Owen set up the system," Ruth said. 2004 for the West, 2006 for the East. Before that he tracked it manually. "Every reading is in here?" "Every one." He turned another page. "These numbers are exceptional," he said. He said it the way you say something that is simply true. "I know," she said. She paused. Owen knew too. He just didn't get to show anyone. She said it plainly, the way Owen would have said something true, and then moved on. Marcus closed the binder and sat with his hands flat on the table and didn't speak for a moment. Which was, Ruth would later think, the right response. He drove back to Missoula that evening. He ran 3 more samples. He brought in a panel taster. He called a colleague at the mill, and they talked about the protein readings and the moisture consistency and the particular character of the flour, not in any romantic language, just in the language of what the numbers showed and what that meant for the product line. The flour was exceptionally consistent. The protein was well above the artisan threshold. The moisture management was, in his colleague's word, textbook. Marcus called Ruth on a Monday. "I'd like to offer you a preferred supplier contract," he said. He told her the price, 6.85 cents per bushel. Against the $4 Dale Frick had mentioned in Ruth's driveway, that gap was $1.75 per bushel on 480 acres, and the arithmetic of that difference was not a rounding error. 3-year term. Total value, $214,000. "I'll need to look it over," Ruth said. "Of course," Marcus said. She called an attorney in Lewistown who handled agricultural contracts. He reviewed the document and called it fair. He said the pricing was, in his experience of what local operators received, remarkable. Ruth signed the contract at the kitchen table on December 4th, with Owen's thermos to her left and the folded co-op printout tucked under the envelope, because she had kept it in her pocket for 2 months and it seemed right to have it present. She sent the countersigned copy back the same afternoon. Filed the original in the kitchen drawer. Went out to check the East Silo's moisture reading. She told no one. In November, something happened that she heard about from Neil secondhand. Dale Fricker tabled a motion at the County Farmers Market Board meeting to update co-op intake standards. A procedural document that, buried in paragraph 4, referenced minimum infrastructure requirements, including silo certification. Not aimed at Ruth by name. It didn't need to be. Several board members glanced at each other during the reading. Pete Schultz, who might have raised a question, said nothing because the co-op was Dale's only buyer, and Pete was not going to make an enemy of his only buyer. Neil heard about the motion the next morning from his neighbor and drove straight to Ruth's farm. He found her in the East Silo, running a moisture check. He told her what the motion said, every detail. Ruth listened. She nodded once. "Do you still have Marcus Webb's number?" she asked. Neil stared at her. "I've already been talking to him," she said. "It's handled." She turned back to the moisture meter. Neil stood in the silo doorway for a moment with absolutely nothing to say. He drove home. He texted Marcus Webb's number to Ruth anyway, because it was the only thing he could think to do. She didn't respond. She already had it. The following September 2023, 1 year to the day after Dale Frick had slid her printout back across the counter, Ruth drove the 40 minutes to the intake meeting again. Same coat, same bag, same dark on the county road before dawn. She had a second lab result in her bag, protein 14.9%. She had been working on that number for 12 months, adjusting the soil program, tightening the moisture schedule, sourcing a different seed variety for the northeast section. Every decision documented, every result logged. 18 miles behind her on the county road, Marcus Webb was driving north in the dark. He had left Missoula before daylight. The manila folder was on the passenger seat. He hadn't been asked to come. He had decided on his own. He thought Ruth might want a witness, and he understood what it meant to be the right witness at the right moment. The co-op floor was unchanged. Diesel and cold morning light. 30 farmers. Dale Frick behind the counter with his clipboard and his 19 years of habit. Ruth waited her turn. She stepped to the counter. She placed the second printout in front of Dale. He reached for it. Same 2 fingers, same reflexive slide, the motion so deeply habitual, he was already looking past the printout to whatever came next in the meeting. And stopped. The door opened behind Ruth. The building's cold morning air shifted. Everyone in that room turned toward the sound. You always turn. It's older than manners. Marcus Webb walked in. Company jacket, the mill's name on the chest, the manila folder in his hand. He crossed the room to the counter without speaking to anyone, placed the folder beside Ruth's lab sheet, opened it, and laid the preferred supplier agreement flat. The mill's name at the top. Ruth Callahan below it. 3-year term. $214,000. Both signatures on the signature lines, dated December 4th of the previous year. Dale's hand was still suspended above the lab sheet. The room went completely quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. The kind where you can hear the fluorescent lights humming and a truck outside ticking down as its engine cools. Not the embarrassed quiet from a year ago. A different quality entirely. The quiet of 30 people reaching the same understanding at the same moment. Dale read the number on the page. He read it again. His lips moved the second time, just slightly. Then he looked through the co-op's east-facing window. Ruth's farm was visible from where he stood, barely, 2 corrugated steel silos behind a line of fence posts in the September distance. Owen's tin cans. Owen's lawn ornaments. He was looking at them the way you look at something you've passed every day for years and suddenly understand you have never actually seen. Marcus turned to Ruth and spoke clearly enough for the room. Your Q4 shipment is confirmed. And I want to talk about expanding to 600 acres next season. Dale sat down on the stool behind the counter. He sat down without deciding to. He did not stand up again. He did not speak. He sat with the number visible on the agreement in front of him and 30 farmers watching and said nothing at all for the remainder of the meeting. Neil Ostrander was in the room. He had watched Dale slide the printout back the previous year. He had set his jaw and looked at the far wall and let it happen. Now he had the whole story in front of him. assembled in one moment, and he understood every piece of it. He found Ruth in the parking lot after the meeting. "I should have said something last year," he said. Ruth looked at him. She thought about it. "You passed my lab result to Marcus 2 years ago," she said. "You didn't know you were doing anything important. You just mentioned a name at a fence line." Neil stared at her. He had forgotten he'd told her about Marcus. He had forgotten the whole conversation. "That was the thing," she said. "That was what mattered." She got in her truck. "Drive safe, Neil." She drove home. Within 6 weeks, 3 local farmers had gone to Marcus Webb independently and asked about direct contracts. They went quietly, without announcement, simply because they had seen something happen and wanted to understand it for themselves. The co-op's intake volume fell by nearly a fifth by the following spring. Dale's infrastructure standards motion failed at the next board vote. Not a single person seconded it. Marcus named Neil publicly at a regional grain conference in Billings that January as the neighbor who had first passed the connection along. Ruth heard about it afterward from a farmer who'd attended. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote Neil a check for $2,000. She put it in an envelope with Owen's Seed Company calendar from 1988, the one with Owen's blue pen notations on the planting pages, his particular cramped handwriting in the margins, and drove it to Neil's mailbox herself without calling ahead. Then she came back and walked out to the east silo. She pressed her palm flat against the corrugated steel. The metal was cold in the October morning, the same October cold it had been every fall since Owen built it in 1991. The same dull gray where the paint had worn, and the same faded band along the weld line, and the same small swallow's nest dried and abandoned under the east eave. Behind her, the mill's delivery truck was parked with the engine idling, the driver patient, waiting to load. Owen's thermos was on the kitchen table. The contract was in the drawer. The silos were exactly where Owen had put them. The work was always real. The only thing that changed was who was watching. Maybe you know someone like Ruth. Maybe you are Ruth, carrying something you know is true, in a room that has decided not to look at it yet. The protein number doesn't negotiate. The moisture log doesn't change its readings based on who's reading them. The truth is patient in a way that contempt never is. It accumulates. It builds, and one day someone walks through a door with a folder, and the room goes very quiet. Owen crumbled a handful of soil 2 days before he died and said the protein was the best it had ever been. He was right. He just didn't get to see how far Ruth would take it. She finished what he started. She did it better than they'd managed together. She did it alone, which was the hardest part and the truest thing she ever did. Tell me in the comments, have you ever kept working at something when no one around you believed in it? What kept you going when the room was against you? I read every comment. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. A farmer, a widow, anyone who's been told their work isn't good enough by someone who never looked. Hit the like button. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Next time, a Ford County cornfield in central Illinois, an October downpour, 6 modern machines buried to their axles, and one 73-year-old man on a 1952 Farmall M who rebuilt it from the oil pan up and was the only rig still running. She had learned the farm in stages. Not all at once, the way you learn anything that is actually complex, which is to say by doing it wrong first, and then doing it less wrong, and then, eventually, by doing it correctly and understanding why it is correct. The soil amendments were the first stage. Owen's notes gave her the framework, but the framework was not the same as the knowledge. The knowledge was in the feel of the soil in your hand, and the smell of it after a rain, and the particular color it turned when the amendment was right. She learned the soil of the west field differently than the east field. The west had better drainage, but a shallower organic layer. The east held moisture longer, but was prone to compaction in a wet spring. The north section had a strip of alkali running through it that Owen had been managing for 20 years with a sulfur program that Ruth had to learn not just to maintain, but to read, because the sulfur rate that was right last year was not automatically right this year. You had to look at the pH test and make a judgment. She made that judgment alone. She was wrong the first time. In 2019, she adjusted. She was less wrong in 2020. By 2021, she was right. Gerald Pratt, the agronomist, came out for the third time in the spring of 2020 and walked the north section with her and looked at the test results and said, "Whatever you did to the sulfur rate last fall, do it again." He said it without elaborating, the way a teacher says something when the student already knows why. Ruth wrote it down in the composition book anyway. What she could not learn from the books or from Gerald was the particular knowledge of the silos. Owen had never written down why he'd oriented them the way he did, facing northeast with the doors on the south side. She had to work it out from the physics, the prevailing north wind, the September sun angle, the way the south door placement kept the grain from direct exposure during the loading and unloading operations. Owen had thought all of this through and not explained any of it. He had just built it right. She stood at the south door of the east silo in the spring of her first season alone and tried to understand what she was looking at. The corrugated steel, the sealed seam, the ventilation gap at the top that Owen had designed to move air without moving moisture. She ran a finger along the interior seal and thought, he knew what he was doing. He always knew. She closed the door and went back to the house and wrote in the composition book, seal intact, vent functioning, door hinges checked. No deviation. She did this every week through that first season. By the end of it, she had 87 moisture readings logged, and she understood the pattern of variation. The way the humidity crept up in the first 2 weeks of September, and then stabilized as the outdoor temperature dropped. Owen had known this pattern. She had to learn it from scratch. She learned it. By the second season, she was making the same adjustments Owen had made before the readings showed the problem, because she had learned to anticipate it. Gerald Pratt, hearing about this in passing, said Owen would approve. He said it simply. Ruth received it simply. She did not think about Dale Frick much during this period. He was a fact of the local landscape, the co-op intake manager, the person who controlled the gateway between a Judith Basin County grain farmer and the market, and she thought about him the way you think about an obstacle you can't move yet. Not with anger, with the patient attention you give to something you are planning around. The $4.10 a bushel offer he made in her driveway had told her everything she needed to know about what he thought of her operation. $0.50 below market rate. Delivered loudly enough for the neighbor's hired hand to hear. Framed as a favor. She had thought about that number in the months since. She had done the arithmetic, $4.10 a bushel, against the market rate of $4.60 on 480 acres at typical yields. The difference was real money. Real money that Dale Frick would pocket as the co-op's margin, while telling Ruth he was doing her a favor. She had declined, politely, and said she'd think about it, and she had never thought about it again. Because the day after he drove away, She had found Marcus Webb's number and made the call, and the $4.10 offer had become irrelevant. But she remembered it. She filed it. She filed everything. 3 weeks before the September 2023 intake meeting, before Ruth drove those 40 minutes in the dark with her second lab result in her canvas bag, she made one last visit to each silo. She ran the full inspection: seal, vent, door hardware, moisture reading from 3 different sampling points at different heights in the grain mass. She entered every reading in the log. She photographed the log page with her phone. She did this not because she was nervous, but because she had always done it. And the value of doing something always is that you are never caught doing it for the first time. The readings were optimal. They had been optimal for 4 consecutive readings. The wheat was in excellent condition. She knew it. The log confirmed it. Marcus Webb's preferred supplier agreement confirmed it. The only person in Judith Basin County who did not know it was Dale Frick, who had never asked. She drove to the meeting. She parked in the co-op lot and sat in the truck for a moment. Owen's thermos was not there. She had left it on the kitchen table. She had brought only the canvas bag and the lab result in her coat pocket and the knowledge of what was sitting in her kitchen drawer 18 miles away. She got out of the truck. She thought about the morning 2 years ago when Neil had mentioned Marcus Webb's name at the fence line. How casual it had been. How unremarkable. 2 neighbors talking about the spring planting, and then a name dropping into the conversation like a stone into still water. No fanfare, no significance that either of them could have named at the time. Neil had been trying to be helpful. He was the kind of neighbor who tried to be helpful without making a production of it, who fixed a fence section when it was down and left before you came back from town, who mentioned things he'd heard in case they were useful, who never pressed for credit. He was, Ruth had come to understand, a man of small dignities, which was the best kind of man. He had passed her lab result to Marcus 2 years before the September morning through a different channel, a mutual contact who had attended a growers' meeting. Neil hadn't known it was Ruth's result. He'd just heard about a Judith Basin operation with exceptional protein numbers and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to Marcus Webb. A chain of casual kindnesses, none of them significant in themselves, adding up to something Ruth could not have arranged on purpose. That was what she had tried to tell him in the parking lot. That was the thing. She signed the contract at the kitchen table and went back to work. The 14.8% protein reading in September 2022, the one Dale had slid back across the counter, was not the peak. She had known it wasn't the peak. The soil program she had built through 3 years of adjustments had more in it. The northeast section, with the corrected sulfur rate, had another improvement to give. The seed change in the east field was producing a different root structure that she could see in the stubble, and that root structure would translate in the following season to better protein uptake. She knew all of this the way Owen had known about the soil, from accumulated observation, from the pattern of readings across time, from the felt knowledge that comes from standing in the same field, in the same season, for enough years that you stop being surprised and start being able to predict. 14,009% in September 2023 was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. She had been waiting for that number, the way you wait for a thing you have worked toward honestly, without anxiety, without impatience, with the simple attention of someone who has done the work and is watching for the result. The result arrived. She drove to the intake meeting. Marcus was already on the road. In the kitchen drawer, the contract waited. The rest is what you saw.